The hearing room at the Vermont Department of Transportation was smaller than I expected, fluorescent lights humming overhead, 3 officials seated behind a long table, with my file open in front of them. I sat in the single chair positioned facing the panel, the way you sit when you're the one being evaluated rather than the one doing the evaluating. A strange position for a man who'd spent 30 years being the one responsible for other people's safety, not the one whose competence was suddenly in question. "Mr. Sullivan," the chairwoman said, glancing down at the paperwork, "we're here today to review a complaint filed regarding your continued licensure, citing concerns about age-related driving safety." The complaint was filed by, she paused, checking the name, your daughter, Karen Sullivan Pierce. I glanced back toward the small gallery of seats behind me. Karen sat 3 rows back, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere on the floor, unable, it seemed, to meet my gaze directly. I thought about a night 39 years earlier, snow coming down so hard the plows had given up entirely, driving the only vehicle in Millbrook capable of pushing through those drifts, Linda in the back seat groaning through contractions that were coming faster than either of us wanted them to. I thought about 30 years of narrow mountain roads, ice storms, whiteouts, thousands of children delivered safely to school and safely home again, not one single accident on my record in 3 decades behind the wheel. "Mr. Sullivan," the chairwoman continued, "do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed with reviewing the evidence?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, the door at the back of the hearing room burst open, loud enough that everyone in the room turned at once. A crowd of people flooded in, more than the small room seemed built to hold, carrying handwritten signs, a thick folder of papers, faces I recognized immediately, even after all these years, children I'd once driven to school now grown, standing shoulder to shoulder with their own parents. The chairwoman raised her gavel, startled. "This is a closed proceeding. I'm afraid you'll need to." With respect, a familiar voice called from the doorway, "I think you're going to want to hear what we have to say first. If you found this story tonight, I'm glad you did. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you'd think to know real people are on the other end of this." A brief note before I continue. This story blends fiction with purpose, crafted for entertainment and the lessons worth carrying home. Names and details are coincidental. What you take away from it, though, is entirely yours to keep. I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. There's a version of what happened in that hearing room Karen might tell people if you asked her. In her version, I imagine, she's a concerned daughter, worried about her aging father's safety, doing what she believed, at the time, was the responsible thing to protect me from myself. I understand, in some ways, why she might need that version to be true. It's easier to live inside a story where you're protecting someone than one where you're taking something from them. I can only tell you what actually happened plainly, the way I spent 30 years teaching young students to look both directions before crossing, carefully, honestly, without embellishment. My name is Robert Sullivan. Most people around Millbrook just call me Bob. I'm 67 years old. For 30 years, I drove a school bus for the Millbrook School District, the same winding mountain roads through every kind of Vermont weather this state can throw at a person. And in all that time, I never once had an accident serious enough to file a report about. I logged over 800,000 miles behind that wheel, carrying other people's children safely, morning after morning, year after year. I raised Karen to understand responsibility, to understand what it means to show up for people who are counting on you, even when the roads are bad and the hour is late and every instinct tells you to stay home instead. I thought she understood that completely. I still believe some part of her does, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this actually began, not in that hearing room, not with a crowd bursting through a door I hadn't expected to open. Let me start 39 years ago, on the worst snowstorm Millbrook had seen in a decade, and the drive that gave me a debt I never once thought my own daughter would someday try to collect on. The storm hit Millbrook on a Tuesday night in February, 39 years ago, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow in under 6 hours, the kind of storm that shuts down every road in the county and strands even the most prepared drivers within minutes of leaving their driveways. Linda went into labor at 11 o'clock that night, 5 weeks early, the contractions coming hard and fast in a way our doctor had warned us could mean complications if we didn't get her to the hospital quickly. I called for an ambulance first, the reasonable thing to do, and the dispatcher told me, with genuine apology in her voice, that every emergency vehicle in the county was either stuck or already committed to another call, and that road conditions made any response time unpredictable, possibly hours. I looked out our kitchen window at my own car, already buried under snow the plows hadn't touched in hours, and I knew, with the particular clarity that comes in moments like that it wasn't getting us anywhere. Then I thought about the school bus. I'd been driving for the district for 6 years by then, and the bus was parked, as it always was overnight, in the depot 2 miles from our house. A heavy, reinforced vehicle built specifically to handle exactly the kind of conditions that had every other vehicle in Millbrook stranded that night. I had a key. I had, more importantly, 30 years of instinct telling me it was the only realistic option we had left. I called the district superintendent at midnight, waking him from a dead sleep, and explained the situation as plainly as I could. He gave me permission without hesitation, understanding immediately what I was asking and why. I walked 2 miles through snow up to my knees to reach that depot, got the bus started, and drove back to our house through drifts that would have buried any ordinary car entirely. I helped Linda into the back seat, wrapped in every blanket we owned, and I drove that school bus through nearly impassable roads for 45 minutes, white-knuckled, praying under my breath the entire way, until we finally reached the hospital in Burlington. Karen was born 6 hours later, small but healthy, 5 weeks early, but strong enough, the doctors told us afterward, that another hour's delay in reaching proper medical care could have meant a very different outcome for both her and Linda. I never talked about that night much over the years, not 'cause it wasn't significant to me, but because I never wanted Karen to feel like she owed me something for simply being born safely. Linda used to tell the story sometimes at family gatherings, embellishing it slightly the way stories get embellished over the years, always ending with the same line, "Your father drove a school bus through a blizzard to save your life before you'd even taken your first breath." I didn't know, standing in that hospital hallway 39 years ago, exhausted and soaked through with melted snow, that the very vehicle that had saved my daughter's life would someday become the thing she'd helped take away from me. Linda passed 6 years ago, a stroke that took her quickly, mercifully some might say, though nothing about losing her felt merciful to me at the time, or fully does even now. I retired from the school district 2 years before that, my 30 years of service marked with a small ceremony the district organized, dozens of former students and their parents showing up to say thank you in a way that genuinely moved me more than I let on at the time. I remember standing at that podium, looking out at faces I'd watched grow up through a rearview mirror morning after morning, feeling like the years had actually meant something beyond just a paycheck. After Linda died, the house felt unbearably quiet, the particular quiet that settles into a home built for 2 people once it's suddenly holding only one. I found myself, in those first difficult months, needing something to do with my hands, my time, the particular restlessness that comes from decades of purposeful routine suddenly having nowhere left to go. I found an old decommissioned school bus at a district auction, purchased it myself with a portion of my retirement savings, and spent the better part of a year restoring it in my own driveway. New upholstery, updated safety equipment, everything brought fully up to code even though it no longer needed to be, technically, since it wasn't being used for actual school transport anymore. I started using it, informally at first, to help elderly neighbors in Millbrook who no longer drove themselves. Patricia Nguyen down the street, whose eyesight had gotten too poor for her own safety behind the wheel. Several others from the senior center who needed rides to medical appointments or the grocery store, but couldn't always arrange transportation otherwise. Word spread through the small town the way word always does in a place like Millbrook, and within a year, my informal volunteer driving had become something close to a regular community service. Twice weekly grocery runs, medical appointment transport, the occasional group outing to a nearby town for something the senior center had organized. I never charged a single person $1 for any of it. I didn't need the money, and more than that, I needed the purpose it gave me, the particular satisfaction of feeling useful again, of driving careful, familiar roads with people who trusted me completely to get them safely where they needed to go. I didn't know, restoring that bus in my driveway, quietly rebuilding a sense of purpose I'd lost when Linda died, that it would eventually become something my own daughter and son-in-law would view not as a service to the community, but as an asset sitting unused, waiting for someone else's better use. Karen married Todd Pierce about 8 years ago, a real estate investment broker with an easy confidence and a habit of talking about opportunities the way other people talk about weather, constantly and always with the underlying assumption that everyone should be paying closer attention to them than they currently were. I liked Todd well enough in the early years of their marriage, even if his particular brand of ambition sometimes felt at odds with the quieter, more careful way I'd always tried to live my own life. The conversations about my age started slowly, about a year after Linda passed, framed always with what I initially believed was genuine concern. "Dad, have you thought about whether you should still be driving that bus?" Karen asked one Sunday dinner, not long after I'd started the volunteer route in earnest. "You're not as young as you used to be. What if something happened?" I told her, honestly, that I felt entirely capable, that 30 years of professional driving experience hadn't simply evaporated because I'd turned 65, and that the community I was serving genuinely needed the help I was providing. The comments continued over the following months, growing gradually more pointed. Todd mentioned, more than once, a minor fender bender I'd had in my personal car, a low-speed parking lot incident that resulted in nothing more than a small dent, the kind of thing that happens to drivers of every age. He brought it up in conversations that had nothing to do with parking lots, framing it as evidence of a broader decline. "We just worry, Dad, Karen said. "You forgot your reading glasses at the senior center twice last month. What if you forgot something more important while you were driving?" I want to be honest about how those comments made me feel. Not just frustrated, though I was that too, but genuinely hurt. The particular sting of watching your own child begin to see you as diminished, unreliable, someone requiring management rather than respect. I didn't yet understand, in those months of growing pressure, that the concern being expressed at our dinner table had very little to do with my actual driving safety, and a great deal to do with a financial situation Todd had been quietly navigating that neither Karen nor I fully understood yet. I only knew that something had shifted between my daughter and me, something I couldn't quite name, and I found myself, more and more, dreading the particular tone her voice took, whenever the subject of my age, my capability, my bus came up at all. Before I go any further, let me pause here for a moment. If you're still with me, drop a comment below and let me know. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you'd think to know there are real people listening on the other end of this. A quick reminder, this story blends fictional elements into its storytelling, crafted for reflection as much as entertainment. If it isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what I found out next changed everything I understood about the pressure I'd been feeling. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, official Department of Transportation letterhead, informing me that a complaint had been filed regarding concerns about my continued licensure, and that a formal hearing would be scheduled to review the matter. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading it, feeling something cold settle into my chest as I processed the particular betrayal of realizing that a formal complaint required a complainant, and that whoever had filed it had done so through official channels, with enough specificity to trigger an actual review. I didn't know yet who had filed it. The letter didn't say, and my first instinct, naively perhaps, was to assume it was simply a bureaucratic overreaction to my age, a routine review triggered by some automatic system flagging drivers over a certain threshold. I got my answer 3 days later, in a way I hadn't expected at all. My phone rang on a Saturday afternoon, a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a voice on the other end asked, carefully, "Mr. Sullivan, Bob Sullivan, from the Millbrook Elementary bus route." "That's me," I said. "This is Amy Chen," she said. "I don't know if you remember me. I rode your bus for 6 years, all through elementary and middle school, Route 14. I remembered her immediately, actually, a quiet, serious little girl who used to sit near the front, always the first one ready when the bus pulled up in the mornings. "Amy Chen," I said, genuinely warmed by the memory. "Of course I remember you. You've grown up quite a bit since I last saw you." "I work at the Department Transportation now," she said, her voice shifting into something more careful, more professional. "I process licensing complaints." "Mr. Sullivan, I need to tell you something. And I want you to know I'm only telling you this because of who you were to me growing up, and because something about your file doesn't sit right with me." I felt my chest tighten. "Your complaint," she said, "was filed by your daughter. There's no accident report attached, no citation history, nothing from law enforcement at all." It's built almost entirely on a personal statement describing incidents that sound, honestly, like ordinary age-related forgetfulness, rather than anything that actually indicates a driving safety risk. I sat with that information for a long moment, the particular grief of hearing, plainly, exactly what my own daughter had put in writing about me. "Mr. Sullivan," Amy said gently, "I think you deserve to understand exactly what you're walking into, and I think you deserve some help preparing for it." I called Frank Delgado the following morning, an old friend who'd served as Millbrook's police chief for nearly 2 decades before retiring 5 years earlier, someone I trusted completely to help me understand a situation I still didn't fully grasp the shape of. "Bob," he said, once I'd explained what Amy had told me, "let me ask you something that might sound strange. Has Todd mentioned any investment projects recently? Anything requiring significant capital?" I thought about it and realized, somewhat uncomfortably, that Todd had in fact mentioned something a few months earlier, a large, mixed-use development project he was trying to get financing for, something he'd described with his usual confident enthusiasm as the opportunity of a lifetime, though he'd never gone into specific financial details with me. Frank did some careful digging over the following week, calling in favors from contacts he still maintained around the county, and what he uncovered troubled him enough that he insisted on coming by my house in person to explain it rather than saying it over the phone. "Bob," he said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, "Todd's development project needs collateral, substantial collateral, to secure the kind of financing he's pursuing." I found paperwork, preliminary, not finalized yet, but paperwork nonetheless, listing your school bus as a potential asset in his overall financial picture. "My bus?" I said, genuinely confused. "It's not worth much. It's decades old." "It's not about current market value," Frank said gently. "It's about the property itself, and more specifically, about you no longer being an active, licensed operator standing in the way of it being liquidated or repurposed as collateral. As long as you're actively using that vehicle for community service under your own license, it's harder to fold it cleanly into someone else's financial plan." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something heavy and sad settle into my chest, understanding finally, fully, exactly what had been happening beneath months of concerned conversations about my age and my safety. "They need me to voluntarily give up my license," I said slowly, "so the bus becomes available for whatever Todd's planning to do with it." "That's what it looks like," Frank said. "I'm sorry, Bob. I know this isn't easy to hear about your own daughter." I thought about a snowstorm 39 years ago, about driving that same kind of bus through impassable roads to save Karen's life before she'd even taken her first breath. "I need your help," I told Frank. "I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into at that hearing, and I need to make sure the people who actually know the truth about my driving have a chance to say so." Amy called me again the following week, this time not simply to warn me, but to offer something more concrete. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "I want to be careful here, because I have to maintain professional boundaries given my role in processing these cases. But there's nothing preventing me from telling you, as a former student rather than as a DOT employee, exactly what kind of documentation tends to be most persuasive in hearings like this." She walked me through it carefully, a clean 30-year driving record, which I already had documented through my old employment file with the school district. Character references from people who'd witnessed my driving firsthand, recent and specific rather than vague. Any medical documentation confirming I had no diagnosed conditions that would genuinely impact driving safety, which my doctor, once I explained the situation, was happy to provide. The complaint itself is thin, Mr. Sullivan, she said. It's built on subjective impressions rather than objective evidence. If you can bring objective evidence of your own, showing a pattern of safe, careful driving and genuine community trust, that's going to matter enormously to the review panel. I spent the following 2 weeks gathering everything Amy suggested, along with something else I hadn't initially planned on, quietly letting a few people in Millbrook know what was actually happening, not to organize anything formally, simply because I found myself, in the loneliness of preparing for that hearing alone, needing to talk to someone who understood exactly what that bus and that 30-year career had actually meant. I mentioned it to Patricia Nguyen first, during one of our regular grocery trips, and I watched her expression shift from casual interest to genuine alarm as I explained what was happening. "Bob," she said, "that's not right. That bus is the only reason half the seniors in this town can still get to their doctor's appointments. Does anyone else know about this hearing?" I told her the date, mostly just to have said it out loud to someone, not fully understanding, in that moment, exactly what Patricia intended to do with that information. It turned out, in the days that followed, that word travels through a small town like Millbrook faster than any single person can fully control once it starts moving, through the senior center, through old parent groups from my years driving the school route, through a community Facebook page I didn't even know existed until Frank showed me a post about my situation that had already accumulated dozens of comments and shares within a single afternoon. I didn't ask for any of it, not directly, but I found myself, walking into that hearing room the following week, no longer entirely certain I'd be facing that panel alone. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, 3 officials seated behind a long table, my 30-year driving file sitting open in front of them alongside Karen's complaint. Karen sat behind me, 3 rows back, unable to meet my eyes, and Todd hadn't come at all, a small, telling absence I noticed immediately. "Mr. Sullivan," the chairwoman began, "we're here today to review a complaint filed regarding your continued licensure." Before she could finish, the door at the back of the room burst open, and what felt like half of Millbrook flooded in at once. Patricia Nguyen leaning on her cane but moving with determined speed. 3 former students I recognized instantly even decades later. Several parents from my old bus route, and behind them, still more people I hadn't expected, carrying a thick folder and handwritten signs that read things like, "We trust Bob Sullivan and 30 years, 0 accidents." "With respect," Patricia called out, her voice carrying clearly across the small room, "I think you're going to want to hear what we have to say first." The chairwoman, visibly startled but professional, allowed a brief statement period, and what followed was more than I ever could have organized myself, even if I'd tried. Amy Chen, careful about her professional role but present as a private citizen, submitted a formal statement outlining the objective weaknesses in the complaint. No accident reports, no citations, no professional evaluation, nothing beyond a family member's subjective concerns. Patricia spoke about the medical appointments I'd driven her to for the past 4 years, about how the community's elderly residents had come to depend on a service that existed entirely because I'd chosen to build it after losing my wife. A former student, now a father himself, stood up and described, in detail, a specific morning 15 years earlier, when I'd noticed a car sliding on ice ahead of the bus and had calmly, skillfully, avoided what could have become a serious accident, a moment he'd apparently never forgotten, precisely because of how composed and capable I'd been in that instant. I watched Karen throughout all of this, still seated 3 rows back, her face going through visible stages of shock, then discomfort, then something that looked, unmistakably, like shame settling in as the room filled with voice after voice testifying to exactly the opposite of what her complaint had claimed. The chairwoman finally raised her hand for quiet, looking between the gathered crowd and Karen with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Pierce," she said carefully, "would you like to respond to what's been presented here today?" Karen stood slowly, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything at all, the entire room waiting in a silence that felt, somehow, louder than everything that had come before it. "I need to explain something," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "This isn't really about Dad's driving." The room went very quiet. "Todd has a development project," she said, the words coming faster now, tumbling out in the particular way confessions do once the first sentence finally breaks the dam holding everything else back. "It needed collateral, and my father's bus was part of the financial plan Todd put together, but only if Dad wasn't actively licensed and operating it anymore. I told myself I was worried about his safety, and some part of that worry was real. I promise you that much is true. But I let that real worry get twisted into something else, because Todd needed this, and I was scared of what would happen to our marriage, to our finances, if the deal fell through." She turned to look at me directly for the first time since the hearing began, tears starting to fall. "I filed a complaint against my own father," she said, "using worry that was real but exaggerated to help secure my husband's investment deal. I am so ashamed of myself right now, standing in this room, hearing everyone talk about who you actually are." I felt something complicated move through me, watching my daughter unravel in front of a room full of people who genuinely, deeply cared about my well-being, not anger exactly, though there was some of that too, but something closer to grief, the particular grief of understanding fully, finally, how fear and financial pressure could distort even a person who loved you into doing something this painful. I stood up slowly, walked back to where she stood, and, in front of everyone, I put my arms around her. "I want to explain why I did that, 'cause I know it might surprise some people hearing this story. It wasn't instant forgiveness. I was still hurt, deeply, by what she'd done. But watching her stand there, breaking apart in front of an entire community, I understood that my daughter needed a father in that moment more than she needed anything else, and 30 years of driving other people's children safely home had taught me something about showing up for someone, even when showing up is complicated, even when it's hard. "We're going to talk about this," I told her quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. Really talk, but not hear. She nodded against my shoulder, crying too hard to speak, and behind us, I heard Patricia Nguyen's voice, gentle but firm, addressing the panel. "I think," she said, "the answer to this hearing is fairly clear at this point. Before I go on, let me pause here for a moment. If this story has reached you tonight, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever watched fear about money quietly reshape how someone you love treats the people around them? I read every comment, and it means more than you'd think to hear from you. A gentle reminder This story carries fictional elements, woven in for reflection as much as entertainment. If that isn't for you, this is a good place to step away. No hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what happened after that hearing room is the part I still think about most. The Department of Transportation formally dismissed the complaint that same day, the chairwoman noting for the record that the evidence presented overwhelmingly supported my continued safe operation of a vehicle, and that the original complaint appeared to have been motivated by circumstances unrelated to genuine safety concerns. I kept my license. I kept the bus. I kept, more importantly, the particular sense of purpose that vehicle had given me in the years since losing Linda. Karen and I had that difficult conversation she'd promised, sitting together at my kitchen table 2 days after the hearing, both of us more honest with each other than we'd managed to be in longer than either of us wanted to admit. She told me about the full extent of Todd's financial pressure, the fear that had been building in her marriage for over a year, the particular way anxiety about money had gradually convinced her that betraying my trust was somehow protecting a larger picture she couldn't fully see her way out of otherwise. Todd's development deal fell apart within the month, unable to secure financing through legitimate collateral once my bus was no longer available to be quietly folded into his plans. I don't know the full details of what that meant for his and Karen's marriage financially, and I've decided, deliberately, not to ask too many probing questions about it. Some things are between a husband and wife to work through in their own time. Karen started seeing a therapist a few weeks later, working through not just the financial anxiety, but the deeper discomfort, I think, of having become someone capable of doing what she did to her own father. We talk regularly now, careful, honest conversations that feel different somehow from the easier, more surface-level relationship we'd settled into in the years since Linda passed. Amy Chen and I have stayed in touch since the hearing, an unexpected friendship built on 30 years of separation and a single act of courage that mattered more than she probably understands, even now. Patricia still rides with me twice a week, same as always, and the rest of Millbrook's senior community continues to depend on a service that nearly disappeared entirely because of a fear that had very little to do with me at all. I still drive that bus most mornings, the same careful, familiar routes through a town that watched me grow up alongside its own children for 30 years, then watched me, more recently, nearly lose everything I'd built afterward. Amy rides along sometimes on weekends now, an easy friendship built on the particular bond of a former student who became, unexpectedly, the reason I still have the license to drive at all. Patricia sits in her usual seat near the front, the same seat she's occupied for 4 years now, and we talk about nothing in particular most mornings, the comfortable, easy conversation of two people who've simply decided to trust each other completely. Karen visits regularly now, and last month, for the first time in longer than I can remember, she asked to come along one of my volunteer routes, sitting quietly in the back, watching me help Patricia and 2 other elderly neighbors in and out of the bus with the same careful attention I once gave to hundreds of children over 3 decades. I never really understood what this actually was to you. She told me afterward, I saw an old bus sitting in your driveway. I didn't see this. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. A lifetime of quiet service to other people doesn't stop mattering just because someone else's fear convinces them it's expendable. If you've spent your life showing up for people, driving them safely home, caring for them when no one else would, building something meaningful out of your own two hands. That work deserves to be protected, not quietly liquidated, because someone else's financial panic needed somewhere convenient to land. I'm not angry at Karen anymore, not the way I was sitting in that hearing room. I understand better now how deeply fear about money can distort even a person who genuinely loves you, until protecting yourself starts to look, in the moment, indistinguishable from betraying someone else. If you see any piece of yourself in this story tonight, if financial fear has ever pushed you toward a decision you're not proud of, I hope you find the courage Karen eventually found standing in that hearing room, choosing honesty over continuing to hide behind a story that was never fully true. This is what a quiet revenge, Dad, means to me. Not cruelty, not anger. Just an old bus driver who spent his whole life getting people safely where they needed to go and refused to let fear take that purpose away from him or from the community that had come quietly to depend on it. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. A last gentle note. Some upcoming stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that isn't for you, no hard feelings, step away.